Good evening et bonsoir. I'm Catherine Spencer-Ross, President of Heritage Ottawa and Chair of our Lecture Series Committee. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture. If you registered early, you'll have signed up for a different lecture. However, due to unavoidable circumstances, our speakers had to reschedule. The good news is their presentation on their Monumental Memories project will launch our 2023-2024 season next September. Even better news, for which we are most grateful, is that Marc Denhez has generously leapt into the breach to speak to us tonight about the challenges of reuse versus demolition of our built resources. Our Q&A session this evening will be hosted by Carolyn Quinn, a former president of Heritage Ottawa and currently our Vice President Communications. Carolyn will come on after the presentation and will moderate the questions and then close our event. Our lecture series is made possible through the generosity of our sponsor, Andrex Holdings, Inc. and Sandy Smallwood. Andrex has been a faithful sponsor of these free lectures, as well as of our walks and some publications. We are also grateful for an operations grant from the City of Ottawa and a heritage grant from the province of Ontario. I'd also like to thank those of you who have made donations to Heritage Ottawa and encourage this concrete form of support. If you are not yet a member, I invite you to join Heritage Ottawa and to make a financial contribution to the organization. Your ongoing support through membership and donations is absolutely critical. The provincial government's new Bill 23 and imposed amendments to Ottawa's new official plan will undermine heritage conservation in our city. Heritage Ottawa's work to protect heritage buildings and historic places is more important than ever. We have launched our fall donation campaign to support our work. We are asking you to help our organization with a contribution. Our board of directors will be matching the first $5,000 raised. Please visit our website for information. Again, heartfelt thanks to those of you who have already made a donation. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. Marc Denhez is a respected lawyer. Under the Industrial Adjustment Service, he chaired a government and industry task force on residential renovation and conducted 3 program reviews for UNESCO. He is a retired member of the Senior Management Group of the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General, the National Capital Commission, Ontario's Conservation Review Board, and Ontario Municipal Board, predecessor to the Ontario Land Tribunal, where he wrote over 800 decisions. He has been published over 250 times in 7 languages. 2 of his publications, specifically on heritage, were distributed by the International Union of Local Authorities and the World Bank. Marc is also past president of Heritage Ottawa. So Marc, your use of the word tunnel in your title suggests there is a way out of a current predicament. Please show us the way. And with that, I will turn the mic over to you.
Welcome to mid-November and what appears to be the first taste of yet another Canadian winter. Yeah, when you dream of heading south, but some still have lingering concerns about COVID, and well, inflation is eating into our budget. So I'm suggesting there's always Brockville. Yeah, Brockville, what some people call Canada's South Coast. And while you're there, you can take in world famous Brockville Tunnel. Well, it's world famous in Brockville anyway. And they did an outstanding job of perking the place up. Sadly, among some people, they ask, how much unbridled excitement can you get out of a hole in the ground? But Brockville hit on a basic truth. If you believe heritage properties are assets, then you treat them like assets. You don't just preserve or conserve assets like sticking them in the fridge or hiding them under the bed. You capitalize on them, like restoring them to what they're supposed to be and making them functional. That's my theme. with tunnels as a metaphor, how the heritage biz got into a tunnel and how do we get out? Now, some people assume that the threat to heritage comes naturally from this disembodied nemesis called the development process. Sometimes that's even true. But part of the threat comes from misdirection. I'll suggest three such headwinds. First, Canada got into a tunnel in the 1940s when officials jiggered the tax system to push demolition and deter fix-up. Next, Canada started trying to get out of the tunnel in the 1970s, but didn't know how to brand it. And third, along with a level playing field in tax and rebranding ourselves, we need more training and know-how. Stakes are huge, not just for fixing heritage, but for our building stock generally. Canadians spend $1.47 perking up existing dwellings for every $1 spent on constructing new ones. For dwellings, 58% of jobs are perking up existing stock versus 42% for new. For residential and non-residential combined, that's over $120 billion a year, one of the largest industries in Canada. Stats Can says that overall building stock is worth almost $6 trillion, exclusive of land. It's the largest and most valuable tangible asset Canadians ever produced. Ontario has over 300,000 dwellings built before 1920 and over 600,000 pre-1945, roughly 1/8 of Ontario's building stock. So let's start at the start. Humanity's been reusing and repairing its buildings for millennia, and it was just cheaper to fix than to start over. Existing buildings were naturally competitive. Before World War II, Canada had no obvious demolition boom. So what happened? How did we get into the tunnel? To answer that, let's look at the 19th century. Victorians inserted ornamental flourishes in every nook and cranny. In the words of Oscar Wilde, nothing succeeds like excess. And then there was the aesthetic of the time that was summarized by Antoine Carême. Of all the forms of architecture, all the forms of art, the greatest is architecture. And of all the forms of architecture, the greatest is pastry making. I mean, London's Albert Hall looks delicious. Sooner or later, there'd be a backlash. Starting in 1910, when Austrian architect Adolf Loos published Ornament and Crime. All previous architecture, which was ornamented, was the work of a criminal or a pathological case. Buildings should look like this. Now, this was followed in 1914 Italy by the Manifesto of Futurist Architecture. Yes, all previous architecture was moronic, to be, quote, combated and despised. Right. It should be replaced by this. Supporters outside Italy renamed themselves modernists, to which architecture schools to this day added the prefix heroic. Germany produced its own Bauhaus Manifesto in 1919 by Walter Gropius. Modernist architecture was the supreme custodian of civilization and the source of all progress. Other styles breached the laws of design, a, quote, source of shame, and their teaching was, quote, perverted. So, to be clear, and strictly in terms of architecture, here, no perverts. Here, perverts. Here, no criminals or pathological cases. Here, criminals and pathological cases. And everything should look industrial. This is what a home should look like. A machine for living and everything should look mass produced. The Bauhaus agenda was introduced to Canada at McGill, led by Principal Cyril James. James was not only a supporter, he was an economist who professed additional arguments. Some had already been outlined by fellow economist Clifford Clark, another vocal fan of the industrial look. His 1930 book, The Skyscraper, urged replacement of our cities with giant skyscrapers linked to city arterials. So Clark, however, reserved his most pungent comments for defenders of existing urbanization with their half-baked theories, with inadequate analysis, the romanticism that throws a glamour over the past. I think he means us. Clark denounced anything with a pre-industrial look, notably the cities which our grandfathers fashioned in the age of horse-drawn vehicles. It looked like what catered to our forefathers prior to the Industrial Revolution. The Journal of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada featured this house of the future, a prefab cube, of course, and it would use that perfect modern material, plastic. And if people were worried that plastic could get cold or that it's combustible, not to worry. It would be made of the very best materials, a plasticized combination of asbestos and urea formaldehyde. But what do we do with pre-existing stuff? One famous architect in Toronto called it the enemy. During World War II, the Journal of the Architectural Institute of Canada described what it most wanted to see bombed. London's Albert Hall and Regent Street were numbers 1 and 2. Here was a plan to replace central Paris with this. Fortunately, it was never executed. Unfortunately, neither was the architect. But during the Depression, there were bigger worries than a non-industrial look. This is where a turning point occurred. A theory launched in 1932 in New York by Bernard London's planned obsolescence. The idea was to stimulate consumption by forcing people to destroy their assets at a predetermined age when they'd, quote, be thrown into a junk pile. For buildings London proposed 25 years old, maybe going all the way to 30, when they'd be declared, quote, legally dead. But if an uncooperative owner insisted on hanging on and, quote, retarding progress, their unpatriotic behavior would be punished by the tax system. This strategy took economists by storm. Same thing for officials. Wording was tweaked. Instead of saying a building was legally dead, they'd say it was beyond its life. Same thing. And disposing of the poor thing would be the responsible thing to do. This got distilled to 3 tactics. The first is called shortening the replacement cycle by truncating the economic life of the asset. Next, eliminating repair and reuse, or at least obfuscating it to the point of irrelevance. And the third was entrenching the package in the tax system. Another turning point in 1932. Prime Minister R.B. Bennett went shopping for a new Deputy Minister of Finance, Canada's senior economic pundit and top tax official. Guess who he chose? And Clark soon had good company. During World War II, the feds created a Committee on Reconstruction to plan national economic strategy. And guess who was chosen to head that grand enterprise? And if anyone thought that this august profile would moderate their language, no such luck. James praised obliteration on a grand scale. At one speech in 1943, he issued a surprise compliment to the Luftwaffe when he referred his audience to, quote, a comparative misfortune that none of the Canadian cities have yet been leveled by the war. But you are eager, as soon as war has finished, to wipe out much of that is unsatisfactory from one end of this dominion to the other, so that you may rebuild effectively. Fellow McGill economist Stephen Leacock's response was sarcastic. The bombing of the great European cities has brought out the fact that they needed bombing anyway. Drop some more. But Leacock was also alarmed by the trend across governments, quote, to shovel up half the city and throw it away. That is the word of the day in every great North American city. The biggest man is the man who will throw it furthest. Later, he will have a statue with a Latin motto on the base, meaning knock it all down. Yeah, Clark and James had lots of company. Just suppose today, a senior official delivered a speech like Cyril James in 1943 about a comparative misfortune that Canadian cities had not yet been leveled. Like, it was a crying shame that terrorists hadn't yet blown up our buildings. They'd be fired on the spot. That didn't happen. Officials took it all in stride, which, as Leacock warned, speaks volumes about the mentality that set in. So, here comes the transcendental leap. When Clark was tasked with rewriting the income tax system, he jiggered it in dozens of ways. I'll mention just a few. Repairs, of course, were so inconsequential that he didn't bother to define them or their tax treatment, but he codified obsolescence in what's called capital cost allowance, or CCA. Then he went further. As one text says, quote, his CCA rates were in many cases far in excess of accounting depreciation rates. To this day, buildings on income properties like rental, residential, commercial, or industrial are presumed to lose about half their value in constant dollars within a decade. Though no one seems to know where in Canada, say, an apartment building loses half its value. And according to the Act, this tragic loss gives rise to a clear tax deduction. Then there's a bunch of clear tax goodies reserved for demolition. If you are a company or a landlord or an entrepreneur, my favorite is what you do to the building's book value when you tear it down. The answer is to say the poor thing got lost, and it's called a terminal loss. And this loss was also made into another nice tax deduction. Still is. Bottom line, in Clark's system of all possible things to do with a property, the best tax treatment was for demolition, better than donating the thing to charity. It didn't stop. In the 1990s, the feds replaced the old manufacturer's sales tax with a GST, promising it would be, of course, revenue neutral, but they doubled taxes for work on existing buildings. Sure, they did introduce what they called a substantial renovation rebate, but only on condition that at least 90% of the non-structural elements be torn out. Canada is the only country which disqualifies an entrepreneur from a tax rebate for not producing enough demolition waste. And what about the flip side of the coin? What about repair and reuse and its obfuscation? Take the GST rebate for creating new homes, the so-called new housing rebate. Now let's look at secondary suites. That's where you take an existing residential building and shoehorn new units into it. Attic, basement, same idea. Yeah, you use that existing space, you use that existing building envelope. No foundations to pour, no water mains to hook up. If Canada were serious about creating thousands or even millions of new homes at a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time, this would be one way to do it. But not if the feds can stop it, because they've used an existing building. They've used the existing building's envelope. And that's a no-no. If you try to shoehorn new units there, this is the only kind of new housing in Canada which is mass disqualified from the new housing rebate. Yeah, you got to give it to the feds. I mean, at least for consistency. 90 years after Bernard London, and they're still singing the same song. And still it goes further. Tax treatment of repair is huge in calculating profit from income properties, because landlords and entrepreneurs doing rehab have to know how much is deductible as repair versus non-deductible capital improvements. Otherwise, you can't calculate your return on investment. And if you write to CRA for a prediction, they'll send you Information Circular 70-6R11 explaining that they refuse to explain. They'll only tell you if it's deductible after you finish the work. Take restoration. CRA's folio S3F4C1 says returning to a previous condition is sometimes, maybe, perhaps, kind of, possibly treated as a deductible repair. But CRA inserts 8 qualifiers. None of this is in the Act, of course, but they'll disallow it if they think it's too durable or too expensive or too helpful in, quote, extending the useful life of the property, or too much of an improvement like asbestos removal. But that's not all. CRA may disallow your deductions if they don't like what's supposedly going on in your head. If they think you anticipated resale, and here's my favorite, if CRA thinks you wanted to take a rundown building and, quote, put it into a suitable condition for use. No, no, no. So rehab investors have to guess at what kind of tax treatment they're likely to get. I know of no other major industry in this country where business planning has been made so artificially difficult. That's uncertainty itself is a deterrent to investment. One Montreal tax expert said, "Is this normal? Since it's impossible to offer any assurances on the tax consequences, it becomes more and more difficult to interest potential investors." Incidentally, Quebec tax officials published literature announcing that for their own purposes, their interpretation reached the opposite conclusion, that restoration by a landlord is indeed tax deductible without qualifiers. So if you're restoring an income property in Quebec and you ask whether the jurisprudence says it's deductible, you get opposite answers from federal and provincial officials. My purpose here isn't to say who's right, who's wrong. My question is, would investors in any other industry tolerate uncertainty like this? And more importantly, if it's impossible for even judges and tax officials to agree on interpretation of the ground rules, then what hope is there for the rest of us, including investors? This is no way to run a $120 billion industry. So to summarize the feds, you can be the proud owner of the most iconic property, but they'll still give you tax goodies if you tear the sucker down, and they won't tell you how they'll treat the repair. Thank you, Ottawa. Yeah, government intervention is the main way that we got into this tunnel. The building stock has been under sentence of death since the 1940s, when official policy made that the default setting. It still does. Now, I'll turn to efforts to get out of the tunnel. In the age of planned obsolescence, there weren't any, or at least almost. Waste wasn't a public issue. Good consumers traded in their cars when the ashtrays were full. But one handful of people wouldn't part with that old stuff, or at least not so much of this. And this extended to buildings. After all, Canada is the only country whose name means the place of the buildings. So it's no surprise that some people wanted to wrap them together with the Canadian identity. But there was a condition. They had to have a pedigree or a vintage. No one asked whether the crisis was contrived. The Pavlovian reflex was to blame everything on those nasty developers. It still is. And the other reflex was, so let's regulate this stuff. Yeah, that's the way to battle the Philistines. But something else was brewing. A 1972 treaty from UNESCO called the World Heritage Convention. Canada signed in 1976. It's best known for featuring World Heritage sites like the Rideau Canal and Quebec City. But one key feature was its checklist of what's expected from government heritage policy. Sure. Protection. Yeah, that was listed, but it wasn't alone. Nor did it take precedence over others, like to give heritage a function in the life of the community and to take the appropriate legal, administrative, and financial measures necessary for that purpose, and to integrate heritage into comprehensive planning programs. It even referred specifically to rehabilitation where appropriate. Now, a caution. Some officials claim that this couldn't be what the treaty meant. No. Heavens no. The treaty is just a vehicle for the World Heritage List, don't you know? And it's not a real treaty, because whatever it said about obligations, hot air, sermonizing, yeah, which can never interfere with an official's turf. Oh no, I won't get into detail except to say this theory was trashed by legal scholars around the world, but you'll still hear it in bureaucratic circles. So, however, at law, it's not legally correct that once a property has been protected, the job's over. The job isn't finished until there's a proper function in the life of the community acknowledged in comprehensive planning programs, which makes sense. Most of these things need fix up, whether it's kicking out the asbestos or dangerous wiring or just perking up the joint. That was the historical backdrop for heritage policy. But before I go further, here's a blatantly ethnocentric digression. Here's the Saint-Germain-des-Prés district of Paris. For years, people have come to its sidewalk bistros to talk philosophy and drink coffee served by rude waiters. It's here that philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus developed existentialism, the philosophy that says you are that you do. We always hear about what heritage is, but what does heritage do? Most people expect studies and reports and studies and peer reviews. Oh, and regulations. I once met a municipal planner who called himself the Heritage Police. Yeah, and if you're lucky, you might even have a grant program. Yeah, you incentivize. Here's where that three-pronged theory comes from. R.A.J. Phillips, named in 1973 to head the Heritage Canada Foundation, now the National Trust. He published it the next year, a brown paper on heritage legislation. He called it the 3 pillars. First, identify select properties of cultural value, perhaps 1 or 2% of a building stock, and segregate them from the other 98%. Next, ask governments to regulate them, to stop owners from doing what they do normally. And third was to ask for economic support for the presumed extra cost of heritage compared to normal property. Yeah, Phillips spoke at McGill, where I was a graduating law student, and I was unconvinced. So I wrote to the man saying, won't work. So he hired me. Phillips assigned to me the task of pushing for these 3 pillars in all 10 provinces. By 1980, we'd done it. The 3 pillars were everywhere. But no one looked at how we branded this. There was no attempt to make the link with fix-up or improvements or jobs or the function in the life of the community. Although Phillips made noises about what shouldn't happen to heritage, his system said absolutely nothing about what should, like revitalization. We paid no attention to the distinction that when built heritage people refer to conservation, it's hands-on. But when conservationists like David Suzuki use that word, it's hands-off. As for the rest of the public, there was certainly no attempt to market test whether buzzwords like preservation and conservation conveyed the right vibe. And since we paid no attention to branding ourselves and the activities we positively supported, like Fix Up, we got branded by our opponents instead. That heritage was anti-development and anti-growth. It was like the immobulus curse in Harry Potter. It freezes everything where it stands. One senior official in one of my hearings said that heritage was, quote, a no-touch zone. The notion that heritage was a freeze on development rather than an alternative format of development had yet more political consequences. We discovered to our horror that the challenge wasn't getting politicians to enact a statute, it was getting them to use it. And it wasn't just political consequences. Now I'll put on my lawyer's hat and talk about legal consequences. Last month on October 21st, the Supreme Court of Canada issued a judgment in Annapolis Group against Halifax. This wasn't specifically about heritage, but about land use controls generally. It said a developer had the right to sue the municipality if those controls deprived the property of all reasonable development potential. De facto expropriation. It was labeled constructive taking, and there appear to be two ingredients. There must be some advantage derived by the state, and second, the owner is deprived of the use and enjoyment of the property in a substantial and unreasonable way. Yeah. So if you're an official who wants to avoid being sued for constructive taking, you must, as a matter of official obligation, address whether there's an ongoing reasonable use, not just what can't happen, but what can and should. Otherwise, you're in legal trouble. Frankly, we should have been doing that since day one. We didn't play our trump card, and that is, okay, I have to be careful about using the word Trump, but you get the idea. Heritage type rehab can be both attractive and popular. When you tell people that buildings should be made to look the way they were intended, it's not a hard sell. To convince them that it's better than covered in grime or looking like they were designed by a committee. But instead, the three pillars got people thinking that the reuse of our older building stock was like castor oil, to be taken oh so rarely out of moral duty or legal obligation or because we've been bribed. Not to mention a semantic boondoggle like conservation and preservation buzzwords. According to theorists in England, preservation meant hands off, but under US law, it means usually hands on. And again, conservation doesn't mean the same thing to environmentalists nor Canadians who think it means sticking stuff in the fridge. Some theorists say you don't dare use the word restoration because some pundit wants to find it differently from the dictionary. Meanwhile, the European Union refers to refurbishment of heritage, but on this side of the pond, the term for fix up depends on who you talk to. You'll hear opposing definitions of retrofit and repair, which the courts sometimes call a remediation, which isn't the same as a home modification, which might be adaptive. Notice that's adaptive with no E, unless, of course, it's an aging in place You can ask the Canadian Renovators Council, but yet they can't call themselves as the US Remodelers Council because those words don't mean the same thing on both sides of the border. And this is Canada's only $120 billion industry, which can't agree on what to call itself. Which brings us to the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes at the National Research Council. In 2019, it announced, will all you people just cut it out? Or words to that effect. They say the new generic word should be alteration, so that restoration and rehab will be part of the AEB industry, alteration to existing buildings. Fine. A brand like Conservation and Preservation failed to convey the clear message to the general public and officials that what we want is a specific format of development here to make the place look as it should. And that word development is legally crucial. A major legal planning document, the provincial policy statement, says right up front, big loud letters, section 1.1.1, it's all about development, stupid, or words to that effect. But we didn't plug into any of that. Almost nowhere is fix-up recognized, even if it's the largest component of the construction industry. And that's a political and legal liability, including at the Ontario Land Tribunal. And now we're paying for it. 3 weeks ago, on October 25th, Ontario presented Bill 23, the More Houses Built Faster Act. One major law firm promptly reacted under the banner, forget everything you thought you knew about planning approvals. First, Bill 23 would rezone every single detached lot in Ontario for a triplex. Don't have to even rezone. And until now, if a municipality considered a property heritage designatable, it could go and designate it via, or alternatively, it could park it for future consideration by listing it on a register. Bill 23 makes that interim register much more crucial. If a council were caught by surprise, like a demolition application for a nice building missed by the register, council would be prohibited from designating it, and down it would come, which means municipalities would be in a scramble to list everything conceivable. But then demands for the documentation also go up. In order to either designate or list it on the register, the province announced that there would be an increase in the threshold. That's their words, not mine. Instead of meeting one criterion out of 9 in the relevant Ontario Regulation 906, a property would need to meet 2. And if owners thought the resulting evidence was insufficient, they could appeal. Similar story for heritage conservation districts. In addition, the register would be periodically reviewed to throw out anything which doesn't meet the new threshold. We don't know how many existing identified properties will be thrown out. And even if a property meets that new threshold, you can't just park it on the register. Bill 23 delivers an ultimatum. It says to councils, launch designation within 2 years of listing or throw it off the register. So the province knows that municipalities don't have the personnel or resources to do most of the heavy procedural stuff. And once the property has been thrown off the register, you can't designate it for another 5 years. As for provincial heritage buildings, the minister would be authorized to review how they got selected. And anyway, cabinet could waive the heritage standards and guidelines anyway. So community groups also lose their right to appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal. The minister is also authorized to intervene on how municipalities regulate demolitions generally, and he can more easily rewrite the terms of their official plan. Sure. And this is all supposed to happen by January 1st of 2023. There are further references without details to a new regulatory authority to assist municipalities to align existing heritage conservation districts with provincial priorities and to, quote, better facilitate development. There's the rub. There's no evidence whatever that when they refer to development, it's anything but new construction. They ignore the predominance of fix-up for GDP and jobs. This isn't development. Heavens no. Yeah, this is development. Yeah, that's what we want. I see 3 hard lessons. First, for heritage fans who hoped to use the regulatory system to battle this contrived economic tide, we're losing. In the words of Dr. Marcus Letourneau, we have failed. Yeah, in Ontario, we're losing that war. Next, as a brand, words like conservation manifestly failed to convince officials that this meant work and GDP and investment and jobs. Granted, that terminology didn't come from us, but from European academics who didn't care if they used the words differently from the general public raised on David Suzuki. But I'm not saying that over 50 years it's been a mediocre brand. I'm saying that from a legal and political standpoint, it's been a disaster. I know some people in government and industry who figure that heritage professionals use this kind of jargon because they have nothing to say about the real world or work or GDP or jobs or investment. My third takeaway, to quote the National Trust, is that we need a reset. We've been sermonizing about this for 50 years in the name of cutesy poo, and some people figure we should just sermonize some more. But we know the we know the reaction of many officials already. I'm reminded of the ancient proverb, if you do what you did, you'll get what you got. That won't do. But this is no time to give up. We need to reconsider the 3 pillars, and we need to play the development card. Yeah, development. Planned obsolescence was discredited in 1987 when the UN's Brundtland Commission called on the world to extend the life of everything it produced in the name of sustainable development. Since a city is the largest tangible object that a civilization produces, then if civilization could reuse items as small as pop bottles and tin cans, it should also reuse items as large as buildings, neighborhoods, and cities, including the fabric of cities, walls, ceilings, whatever, instead of sending them all to the dump. This report denounced, quote, indiscriminate demolition and popularized the alternative of sustainability. But officials didn't notice. And anyway, easier said than done. Suppose you're a keen property owner and you've decided to restore that rundown porch. In the words of Ghostbusters, who are you going to call? And here's another legacy of government disinterest. Training on how to fix anything was non-existent. Until the 1990s, not a single architecture school in Canada offered fix-up as part of the core curriculum. Trades weren't much better, and developers, they weren't exposed to investing in older buildings either. Lately, there's been an upsurge in firms that at least provide a warranty, and some know what they're doing, and some others maybe not so much. But instead of talking about what shouldn't happen, what if we focused on what should? Here are ugly ducklings. This one belonged to a good friend of mine, but I thought this was just plain hideous. This is what he turned it into, looking the way it was intended to, with proper mechanical and electrical systems that won't fry in the night. It's now an embassy, thank you very much. Here's a huge one that he rehabbed, an asbestos-laden former army hospital from 1867. He made local real estate history by selling out his phase 1 condos within 24 hours. A market-driven project by the private sector with tiny local support and huge institutional obstacles, which raises this question. If this is feasible with that little support, what would we be capable of as a country if we had some real planning and strategy devoted to the repair and reuse industry? It's often a question of hiring people in the know. I remain convinced that countless Canadians who pick the wrong people are paying too much. Here's Ottawa's Aberdeen Pavilion, or Cattle Castle. A National Historic Site. Ottawa first won Lord Stanley's Cup here. So this was sacred ground. But it was owned and maintained by the city, which means it wasn't maintained at all. In the 1990s, the then mayor asked architects how much it would cost to fix it. $11.5 million for a bare bones job. Add bells and whistles, and you hit $14.5 million. Too rich for council, so they voted to demolish the thing. That's when I headed a small development company. With business friends and private money, we offered to take this white elephant off the city's hands, fix it, and turn it into a festival market like St. Lawrence Market in Toronto. We'd not only add all the bells and whistles, but also fix the large redundant building next door. Our secret weapon was our architect, a guy who, through experience, really knew how to kick the tires on fixing historic buildings. Instead of doing one bare bones project for $11.5 million, he showed us how to do 2 buildings fully decked out for $9.9 million. When council got wind of this, the same councillors who voted for demolition announced it would be unconscionable for this national historic site to fall into the hands of the private sector. So they turfed us out and decided to fix it themselves, but with our architect. He was told to bring it back, a bare bones project with 1 building, not 2. He did, not at $11.5 million, not at 9.9, but at $4.6 million. He used every trick in the book. So I repeat, how many Canadians are paying too much? So here's my big recap. The unpredictability and expertise in how to do good rehab on a budget is the #1 deterrent to a multi-billion-dollar upsurge in investment. The inability to predict after-tax income is #2. The ultimate objective has to be to make our older building stock capable of taking care of itself, of creating an overall context where Canadians want to do the right thing and know how to do it on a budget without 1,000,001 artificial obstacles, a system where people reuse older buildings, not just because they've been forced to or because they've been bribed, but because it's the manifestly logical thing to do. In time, developers will be the acid test for putting heritage on a self-sustaining footing. That can't be achieved until the day comes when it's as easy or easier for a developer or owner to do the right thing with an older property as it's been to do the wrong thing. It's often hard to draw attention to how great these assets are, but that isn't our main goal. Our main goal, which is actually an easier sell, is to draw attention to how great these assets can become, like what they did with the Brockville Tunnel. It's paradoxical, but heritage is really about promoting a vision of the future and a process that leads to that future. But what do we do about it? On the tax front, many people pushed tax incentives and other tweaks and perks. The feds have proven utterly uninterested. But the system doesn't need a tweak or perk. It needs a comprehensive rethink of our overall treatment of buildings, obsolescence to demolition to repair together. That's something Canadians never have asked for in 70 years. We never asked tax officials, how do we bring sustainability to this country's largest collection of assets? This requires nothing short of a fundamental reanalysis. I'm not suggesting a panacea. There will still be cases where economics are so wonky that a regulatory response is the only option. But we'll have moved the yardsticks. I'm not even asking governments to support sustainability of our largest assets, but for starters, they should at least get out of the way. Next, we need to rebrand. I'm no PR expert, but I like how our counterparts in BC refer to heritage revitalization agreements. And as part of Canada's national housing strategy, the National Housing Co-Investment Fund announces that it's going to revitalize affordable housing. Yeah, revitalize. Here's branding. Our counterparts in India plug straight into the sustainability agenda, and this messaging is as upbeat as it gets. We can't hide our light under a bushel basket. The work we support is not only a multi-billion-dollar form of development, it's also some of the most high visibility development, which we believe closest to the public's heart. We're not here just to circle the wagons and say Ontario should just conserve and preserve and preserve and conserve these assets. We want to stand up and say it's time for Ontario to capitalize on them. Pardon me. But we'll have to know what we're doing. We need far more people who can fix up these things correctly and on a budget. We need the training. We need the R&D. Eventually, we may even need a certification system to recognize people who know what the hang they're doing. But if we pull all of that off, we'll have made heritage more naturally competitive. And that means we'll start seeing daylight. Thank you.
It's Carolyn Quinn. Thank you, Catherine, for introducing me earlier this evening. And I'd like to start by saying thank you, Marc, for a very insightful and highly entertaining talk this evening. You did not disappoint. I have to say, the series of images just kept me on the edge of my seat. So thank you for that. And as I said, for the insights and the challenges, I think, that you've brought forward, that I think we should all be thinking about. And it is certainly, I think, some starting points for some great conversations, but big challenges. You know, getting into the Tax Act can be scary for a lot of people. So we need probably a lot of handholding in that regard, but certainly, as you say, it is long overdue.
Well, it was one of the few times I actually got into Columbo's Canadian quotations. Was from an earlier book in which I said that anybody who believes that Canada's two official languages are English and French has never read the Income Tax Act.
Yes, well, I haven't, so because I don't speak the language. But we're not wrapping up, folks. We're just moving over to the Q&A portion of the evening. And I am very pleased to be able to look through some questions, which I can see are already coming in. I think we'll start here. One question is, if you think heritage properties are assets, you promote your assets. How do you make this objective politically and electorally attractive?
Now, isn't that the $64 question?
Isn't it just?
The first thing we have to do is what we call in French a prise de conscience. We have to acknowledge what it is that we're all about. And that means rebranding. We have to identify ourselves in terms that our audience will understand. I've had, I don't know how many occasions to see people stand up at a podium and say, well, we'll just have to teach the rest of the country what the true meaning of conservation is under the various international charters. Like, you think? Okay, the problem with all of this is basic rule of communication. If we're going to communicate anything, we have to communicate in terms of the interests of the people we're communicating with. If we do not appeal to those interests, we're dead. We do not get out of the starting gate. So that is my first recommendation. Second recommendation, how do we get through to the politicians? How we get through to the media? Yeah, that's a tenacity city. It just is going to take repeated and consistent effort. But we cannot get to step 2 until we've fully addressed step 1.
Right. Well, that makes sense. And the same, a follow-up to that question asks about the Graber plan for Ottawa, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Marc. And if it was a bad thing for this city, never mind the raising of Lower Town, which wasn't in his plan, but generally speaking, that kind of overarching concept plan and where it and decisions that evolved from that. Good or bad? That's the question.
Generally good. Okay, there were a lot of things that were accumulated over time in various plans. If you look at the plans back in the 1920s, Ottawa was supposed to look like Vienna. We were going to have something that looked very, very much in a neo-Gothic kind of motif, and it was going to be all over the place. That that really was drummed out of the equation long before Gray Bears set foot here. So I don't think we can pin that aspect of it on him. What did get built from his plan was overwhelmingly the parkway system. And I can think of a lot of other cities across North America that would have said, why do a parkway with parks here when you could have a 12-lane superhighway? And we did not do that. And so
Right.
I credit him with having some good ideas which were properly followed.
Thank you, Mark. Good question and a timely one. Is there any hope of stopping Bill 23? And who do we talk to first?
That's two questions, actually.
Start with the
First-
first one.
Okay, is there any hope? I don't play the odds in Las Vegas, and I have a very limited ability to roll the dice. So I find that very difficult to answer. I would like to think that it is still possible to change the Ford government's mind. I heard accounts today that said that, and I don't know how true they are, but just passing them on, that although the Environmental Registry of Ontario gives the citizenry until November the 24th to post their comments on Bill 23, that's all quite pointless because it will have been passed by November the 22nd, which is this coming Tuesday. Now, I don't know how true that is, but certainly this is coming from some people who profess to be insiders in the entire operation. So how can we, this is not trying to change the Queen Mary. This is trying to change something that's moving at 600 miles an hour. So I don't know what our prospects are, what are our mechanisms at our disposal. My first suggestion would be to contact your own MPP and say your mind.
Okay. And there's also the opportunity to submit, as you said, in writing to the committee, which is currently reviewing, and whether it's up until the 22nd or the 24th.
We have a peculiar situation there. For example, this goes in front of a legislative committee that's called Heritage and Cultural Policy. Well, the provincial heritage organization, which is Architectural Conservancy Ontario, made a request to speak about heritage to the Committee on Heritage about amendments to the Ontario Heritage Act. No, it's refused. However, Canadian Cement Association gets to be invited, and I'm sure the Canadian Cement Association will have some remarkable insights into cultural policy for Ontario.
Okay, I'll move on to another question. So have we been foolish to concentrate on the HCA instead of various financial legislative tools?
Didn't know about them. Okay, yeah, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, what should have occurred, and I say should have occurred in the 1970s, and I cannot disclaim some of the responsibility. I was part of that scene too. Oh God. The truth of the matter is, we never dug into the question of how did we get here in the first place? How did we get into the soup anyway? We never asked the question, why is it that the development process seems to be so much more hostile to older buildings now than it used to be? Never asked the question. So have we been foolish in trying to pursue the regulatory route over all of this time? Well, it is true that it is awfully difficult to try to use a regulatory process in order to paper over an economic problem. But had we known at the time, I think we would have approached it very, very differently. And now that we're starting to do the analysis, now that we're starting to see exactly how the system was perverted, and I use that word advisedly, in the 1930s and 1940s, maybe we are going to have an opportunity to say, okay, look, Government of Canada, Government of Ontario, everybody else, time to open the windows and bring in some thinking that somehow evolved beyond 1948.
It's challenging. It's daunting. Another question here, how to convince politicians that reusing heritage properties is worthwhile when they will not add to the housing stock?
Well, they can add to the housing stock. As I said in my presentation, if you wanted to create thousands upon thousands of new housing units without building any new building envelope and without connecting a single new water main, all you would have to do is to say, let's focus for starters on secondary suites. And secondary suites are a natural. There are all kinds of other opportunities. Intensification, of course, has been a priority of provincial policy for the last 25 years. Thing is, look at where are the areas that are most crying out for intensification. You will find all kinds of opportunities, for example, on suburban arterial roads. I mean, a person could easily drive in through any suburb of Ottawa and come to the conclusion that on the main highways, local residents do nothing but eat burgers and have their mufflers fixed. This is and a lot of these places are in serious trouble because they were built before the rise of internet retail, and many strip malls across North America are crying the blues. If there was one place that we want to intensify, it's in those various one-story, purely commercially zoned establishments with their ocean of asphalt parking around them. This is the place that you can build and build and build without demolishing a single housing unit to get started.
Good point. Another question, this starting with a compliment that with a thanking you for a great talk. My question for you is, where are the banks in all of this? If development of existing buildings is such a big business in Canada, why is it so hard to get these projects financed? Why is it so easy by comparison to get a bank to finance a greenfield development or demolition and new build?
If I'm a major developer and I want to sit down with my friendly bank manager and I'm going to build a greenfield project in the middle of nowhere, okay, I know what my costs are going to be. I know what my return on investment is likely to be. I can show them a pro forma balance sheet, and I can demonstrate that this either has a good ROI, return on investment, or it doesn't. Compare that to a person who takes on the rehab and reuse of an existing building. They don't know what's behind the wall. If they did know what's behind the wall, they don't necessarily know who has the skills to fix it. And above it and beyond everything else, they can't calculate their return on investment because Finance Canada and Canada Revenue Agency won't let them. So yeah, if we were to talk just pure business, I take my hat off to people like Sandy Smallwood, who had the guts to go ahead and do it anyway because he believed in the darn project. But trying to say that it's an easy task, it is way harder than it deserves to be. We are the only $120 billion industry in Canada that has to put up with it.
Thank you. Another question. Do you think heritage would benefit from the trend of taxation takes better account of carbon footprint? The greenest building is the one you already have, ?
That's certainly an argument that's been used over and over and over the last 20 years. I don't know whether the people who've been advancing it are terribly happy with the success they've had. I haven't heard anybody say that they're deliriously happy with the kind of response they've gotten from tax officials. It's an argument that is worth advancing, obviously. Whether it's going to decide anything is a different question.
Okay, thank you. Switching over to a listed properties question. The Heritage Planners Network in Ontario, approximately 65 municipalities, has indicated that they have in the range of 31,400 listed properties.
I think it's
What
north
can
of there,
we-
actually.
It's even higher.
It might be higher than that because the city of Toronto is claiming 30,000 all by itself.
All by itself.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what can we do to try to raise the issue of the importance of so many sites that could be kicked off these municipal registers as a result of Bill 23?
Oh, now, isn't that a good question? I don't know the answer to that. I think the only thing I can offer is the same suggestion I made earlier, and that is that municipalities have to stand up and speak their mind. The difficulty that was faced here is that the announcement of Bill 23 came the day after municipal elections, and the instructions from the province was that there were going to be no swear-in ceremonies before November the 15th. So there was an automatic 3-week period where there was no council anywhere in Ontario that could speak out. Okay, so I mean, this bewilders me. The obvious choice to speak out is the municipal council, because whether it's the Ontario Heritage Act, whether it's the Municipal Act, whether it's the Planning Act, there is a widespread assault on municipal jurisdiction to such an extent that, you know, we have the Planning Act, which according to planning law specialists is being eviscerated. We know the OHA is being eviscerated. You have various other bits and pieces of legislation all over God's creation, not to mention all the environmental concerns. So yeah, the municipal council is, in my view, the best avenue that's still left, but there's not a lot of time.
No. I think on that note, you've given us a good over 10 minutes of your extra time, Mark. So thank you. But I think that's a good note to end on because the call is there. Certainly, Heritage Ottawa has it up on their website. The call to action with a list of all of the councillors, or I'm sorry, the MPPs that sit on the committee right now. But as Mark said, start with your own MPP. This is really critical. This is some of the most important stuff to happen to us in decades. Yeah. It's a real gut punch, frankly, after working and volunteering in this sector.
Yeah, it sets us back 50 years.
It is absolutely, as somebody here in a question that I don't think I got to, it says basically it's has dropped a bomb on heritage. And so I think we can't say enough in urging everybody who is in attendance this evening to just take that 5 minutes to shoot off an email and just make even if it's a short statement. We need, at the very least, we've got to at least get some amendments to this bill. So, Mark, I think I will let you off the hook here. You've given us so much this evening. It's really stimulating, and it really, I think this bill and the ramifications really is forcing us to have a rethink. And you've set a nice place for us to start, and more of this kind of discussion has to happen. And I'm really pleased that you've opened us up to this kind of thinking. So thank you. Thank everybody who has joined us this evening and continuing to participate and in the process support Heritage Ottawa. And so a final note before I sign us off is a reminder that our next lecture in December is our first in-person lecture, I believe. Oh, that's not quite true. We did one special for member, but our first public lecture since 2019. And it's going to be at the Great Hall of Christ Church Cathedral on the 14th of December. And our presenters will be Patricia Jason and Richard Hinchcliffe, authors of the new book, Building Canada's Farm, an illustrated guide to buildings at the Central Experimental Farm. And they will look at the history and cultural significance of 3 areas that make up the farm's pastoral landscape. Their book will also be available for sale at the event, and their presentation will be followed by a seasonal reception. So should pandemic conditions and weather require, we will switch to an online format, but fingers crossed that we'll be able to see each other in person. And that again is a very timely talk, because as we know, the Central Experimental Farm National Historic Site is a very precious landmark that has no legal protection in Canada. And the time for that to change is also now. So on that note, I am going to say goodnight and thank you all once again.